elephant. This is an old bull of the herd, and it's an old, and the rest other elephants drove it out, and it started becoming destructive. So the government was going to have it destroyed, but they let the safari hunter shoot it, and one of the cubs shot it, and it's here today in the exhibit.
And I finally got her go in the water and she was playing.
Okay, this is the boat history, and we're talking to If I talk?
She was complaining it was too hot, and I finally got her go in the water and she was playing because she's too cold.
Okay, this is the boat history, and we're talking
She
to
said you told her she should have been born a queen.
Bob. I'm sorry. And I'll ask you a few
She
questions.
said I should have been
Okay.
a king and she'd be one.
What do you remember about Louis Bowe?
What do I remember about Louis Bowe? Oh, he was a tall man, about 6'2", 6'1", 6'2". He had a big mustache. And I can remember riding on the horse and riding behind the saddle on the horse and going to the creek and catfishing and going after the milk cows and picking choke cherries with him. And every evening he'd go out and sit in the yard in the summertime and he'd chew his tobacco and he'd throw his big leaf off the spark plug of tobacco over behind him. And Ivan and I, we'd get that leaf of tobacco and we'd chew on the edge of it. And then sometimes it'd make us sick.
Okay. What do you remember about Ragnar?
Oh, she was fairly tall too, for a woman. But I remember she always had cookies for us kids. Or something big. She'd always bake something. She did a lot of canning and she always had turkeys and chickens and that was really her pride. Her pocket money was her turkeys and her eggs that she.
What do you remember about Walter Burke?
Walter Burke? Oh, he was fairly tall too, but he was probably 6 foot and he loved dogs and he loved the West and he always wanted the biggest hat in Wyoming. He lived in Wyoming, but he was really proud that he was a Westerner. And
what do you remember about Rose Burke?
oh, how Rose loved children. Impressed me more than anything. She was always wanted to hold the babies.
What do you remember about your mother?
Oh, how she loved the kids and took care of them and worried about them and how she could raw.
Your father?
I'm on Dad. Oh, how he used to go with us boys and take us fishing all the time, and always seemed to be with the boys.
What is your best childhood memory?
Oh, when I lived in Wyoming, when I was a young guy, about 15, 16 years old, and riding and on the ranch.
What is your worst or scariest childhood memory?
Well, or I don't really remember any scary ones.
Any other childhood moments you'd like to talk about?
Wait a minute. I think I tried Christmas Eve.
Oh, I can't think of anything right off.
Tell me just a little bit about Kenny.
Well, Kenny and I worked together and farmed together. Kenny was really easy going. He's a hard worker. And Kenny, he liked to visit. He could sit and visit by the hours. He was a real sociable person.
Thank you.
Now what?
Okay, this is Ivan Bow, and this is another one of the brothers, and we're gonna ask questions.
No, but I did. I just
Okay, what do you remember about Louis Bow?
Well, he was my grandpa. And he always had a great big white mustache. And he chewed tobacco, and once in a while he'd get that on his bottom of his mustache, and then he'd have to go wash it off, because he probably figured it might scare a horse. He was usually riding a horse, as I remember too. And when I was about 2 and 3 years old, he would put me right back of the saddle horn, right up on the top of the saddle, and give me a ride. And we would go out and get catfish early in the morning. He set lines, and we would go out there and get those catfish. And at that time, he had a big sorrel mare. You know what a sorrel is? It's kind of a reddish color. Anyway, this big sorrel mare's name was Ingy. And I remember riding Ingy with him many times and coming back, and we'd have these big old catfish hanging from the saddle.
What do you remember about Ragnar?
Well, that was my Grandma Bo. And we didn't call her Ragnar, we called her Grandma Bo. She came from Norway when she was 19 years old. And she came up in the Lead area and worked for a family for a while. And she married my grandpa, and they built a big house out by Newell. And she was a real tall lady and very, very business-like lady. And I knew her very well because I stayed with her my senior year in high school in Newell. She had a little house at that time. My grandpa had died. And I got to know her very well.
What do you remember about your grandpa Walter Burke?
Well, Walter Burke was a great big tall guy. He was about the same size as my Grandpa Bo, about 6'1". And that was tall in those years. And he smoked a great big pipe. He'd sit down in a big rocking chair and smoke a pipe and go back and forth, and that was his way of relaxing. And he had a big sheep ranch up in Wyoming. And he'd go out there on he had a big white horse. And he'd get on that white horse and ride around and look at his sheep. That's how I remember him.
What do you remember about your Grandma Rose?
Well, Grandma Rose was a real bubbly person. She was kind of short and kind of chunky. And she would get laughing, we'd be talking, and someone hit her funny bone, and she'd laugh and laugh.
Okay.
And she was a real short, chubby lady, and she had about 5 sisters, and they were all the same shape, and you couldn't hardly tell one from the other. And I met all of her sisters, I guess, and one of her brothers, and we got them all together one time back in Indiana. Another person and I rounded them up. We went to their different houses and we got them all together, and that's the first time they'd been together for 10 or 15 years. And she was very old then.
What do you remember about your father?
Well, my father was Rudolph Bow, and he taught Rudolph Bow, my dad, taught us how to fish when we were small. He took us fishing a lot, and we camped overnight in Ormond Dam. And he taught us how to shoot rabbits and how to hunt. And he and my mother taught us how to garden. And I think all my brothers and sisters learned that from those things from my father.
What do you remember about your mother?
Well, my mother was a real kind person, and she was a school teacher like your mother. And she went here to Spearfish to the normal school, and she used to go teaching in a buggy with a one horse pulling the buggy. And one time she had a wreck. The horse started running over on Horse Creek Hill, and the shaft on one side of the horse went through the horse's side and killed the horse. Did you ever hear that story? But she was real nice lady.
What's your best childhood
Wonderful, Archie.
Pardon?
What's your best childhood memory?
Well, my best childhood memory? Oh, I guess one of my best childhood memories was when I was quite small and 7 or 8 years old, and we would go down on Horse Creek in the summertime. Early in the morning, we would get up and we would hoe the garden. And then my mother would take a frying pan and give us this frying pan with some bread and butter and some matches. And we would go down and we would fish all day long on the creek. And we'd stay down there at noon, and rather than come home for lunch, we would fry the fish that we caught and have bread and butter and fish. And then we'd swim and fish all day long, and then we'd come back and milk cows in the evening. I learned to milk cows when I was 5 years old.
What is your worst or scariest childhood memory?
Well, that was when I was probably 3 years. Well, I had 2 very scary things that I remember, actually. One, I was about 2 or 3 years old, and a great big freckled-faced cow with horns didn't want me to play with its calf, like I was trying to do. And she, with her horns, rolled me under the fence. And I got under the fence and got away, but I was kind of sore for a while, because that cow was booting me with its horns. And the second was my older brother Bob. He was 16 months older, and I was about I was probably about 2 years old, and he was probably about 3.5 years old. And we were out in this pasture, and we had a big boar, big male hog, and that hog had great big tusks. And we got out in this pasture, and we saw that with that boar, he was a lot bigger than we were. He looked like an elephant. And we hid in in a little draw that had a whole bunch of tumbleweeds in. And we got down in there and tried to hide from that boar until it went away, and then we ran and crawled over the fence. And those were my 2 scariest periods in my life.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about Kenny.
Well, Kenny was 2 years younger than I. And Kenny and I used to go, went fishing with us, and he was spending a lot of time, because he was so close to my age, and he was always taller for his age than I was, so we were always about the same size. So we had a lot of fun growing up. And then after we were growing up, we did some electrical work together. I taught him how to wire homes and things like that. And then he got married, and he was in a terrible car accident. And that's when he was 29 years old.
Anything else you would like to talk about?
Well, I have a real nice little niece, and she lives in Omaha. Her name is Ashley. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
They're pretty careful.
Okay, this is Elmer Rowe. And what do you remember about your Grandpa Louis Bow?
My Grandpa Louis Bow was, I remember his big white mustache, and up until I was 8 years old, we lived in the same house as they did, although they had an apartment in a big farmhouse, and he teased me a lot. I used to be over there a lot, and he and Grandma spoke Norwegian a lot when I was around, and I had lots of good memories, my Grandpa and Grandma Bow, because I spent a lot of time with them, and I was the only girl around then, so they spoiled me. They thought I was pretty special.
What do you remember about Walter Burke?
Walter Burke was my other grandpa, and Walter Burke liked the West, and he wore a great big Western hat, and he didn't put any crease in it or anything. He wore it as big and tall as he could. One thing, he was proud of being an Irishman, and I'm sure he wasn't all Irish, but he called himself an Irishman and was proud of that.
What do you remember about your Grandma Rose?
Grandma was a lot of fun. She was a short, fat lady, and she laughed a lot, and she'd sit us on her lap and say funny rhymes to us, and we'd just laugh and have a good time. But you forgot Grandma, the other Grandma. Grandma Ragnhild. I used to go and stay every summer with Grandma Bow. When we moved to Wyoming for 5 years, I went and spent 2 or 3 weeks every summer with her, and then when I went to high school, I stayed with her for 1.5 years in town, so I was with her enough that she would even look at me and start speaking in Norwegian once in a while, forgetting that I didn't talk Norwegian. And we had a real close relationship. She was always making sure that I knew how to crochet and tat and knit and all these things like this. And if she didn't know how to do these things, she had a neighbor lady teach me. So I learned how to do all these things.
What do you remember about your mother?
My mother was a really special person, and she hadn't had any sisters, and for a long time I didn't have a sister either, so we were real close and talked to each other about everything, and really she gave her life for her family, didn't ever think about herself, was always doing something for somebody else.
What do you remember about your father?
My father was a generous person, and I remember most that I could talk him into, when I got to be a teenager and I wanted to do something, I could usually talk him into letting me do it.
What is your best childhood memory?
Let me think about that for a while. Go on to the next one.
What is your worst childhood memory?
Oh dear.
What do you remember about Kenny?
Kenny was 2 years older than I, and we were really close. Kenny and I did a lot of things together. I guess one thing I remember was in the summer we lived not far from the Belfouche River, and every day we'd go swimming, and an older brother had to go with us, and it was usually Kenny. We'd all put on our swimming suits and trail over the little trail through the cottonwood trees and over to the river and go swimming. And one time the river was up a little bit, but nobody knew it was up a little bit. And that was the day I learned to swim. So we'd get in where you could touch bottom, and then we'd swim down the river to the next riffle where we could get out, and then we'd climb out and we'd walk back up the river, and then we'd go down the river again.
What is your best childhood memory?
Oh, my best childhood memory. That's hard to tell.
What's your worst or scariest childhood?
Oh, I think one of the scariest times was when we lived out in Wyoming. We had the school right in our yard, and the school teacher stayed with us. It was just our family in school. And one evening, my dad was gone. He was probably out to sheep camp or something. And the teacher had left to go somewhere, and we were all sitting around the stove, a big potbelly stove, and Mom was nursing the baby, and we were all sitting around the stove warming our feet and talking before we went to bed, and all of a sudden somebody came into the other part of the house. Scared me to death. And my mother picked up the lamp and ran in there to see who it was. And it was the school teacher. He'd come back to get something. I think that was one of my scariest moments.
Thank you.
Okay. You'll have
Stand right there. You can stand right behind her and look in there. Put your glasses on. You want to? Okay, this is Bryce Bo. He's my grandpa. And what do you remember about your grandpa Bo?
Well, my grandpa Bo, I don't remember too much about him. I remember that he was, when he was quite sick, shortly before he died. And I remember that he used to smoke by burning some tobacco in a little tray and inhaling it. But I really don't remember much about him before, just before he died.
What do you remember about your grandma Bo?
Well, Grandma Bo, I remember a lot about her. She was a very proper, dignified lady, and she used to make a lot of cookies, and she made a kind of a Norwegian cookie crisp that she rolled up on an iron, and they were really special. And she lived in Newell for several years after she left the farm. in a little house, and we used to stop in every time we went to town.
What do you remember about your Grandpa Burke?
Well, Grandpa Burke, he was a great big cowboy, and he had about a 15-gallon Stetson. And you didn't see him get too far away from that Stetson hat. And I remember he never would eat ketchup because he used to work in the railroad back in Indiana. And he said he hauled a lot of train loads of tomatoes that they was going to go make ketchup out of them. And he liked beefsteak. He liked to eat good steaks. I remember that about him.
What do you remember about your Grandma Burke?
Well, Grandma Burke was kind of a little gray-haired lady, and she had some partially Pennsylvania Dutch, partially English, and she lived in Vail for quite a while, toward the end of her life, and she was always good to the kids. I remember that about her.
What do you remember about your mom?
Well, my mom was really kind to everybody, and she really took care of all of us. And well, I don't remember any specific thing, I guess. But
What about your father?
well, my dad, he wore big cowboy hats too. And he wore white shirts. I remember that all the time. And he ran a grocery store and kind of a hotel. And we have a picture of him in his grocery store. And okay.
What do you remember about Kenny?
Kenny? Well, Kenny and I, we had a lot of good times together. And Kenny worked for me for a few years before he was killed in a car accident. And I remember it was very sad when we had the accident. We used to go out together on weekends when we lived in Rapid City. And Kenny and Ivan had a wiring contracting company, and we used to wire houses down eastern South Dakota. And we used to go fishing, and we used to go swimming. We used to have a swimming hole in the creek, and we'd always take an inner tube, and it seemed like in the summertime we went swimming about every day. I remember I learned to swim when I was about 8 years old, and Ivan and Kenny and I were putting up hay. And back in them days, we put up hay with ropes. All we had was ropes, and I had a great big old horse that was blind in one eye. Then I'd lead this horse. And I had to reach up to his nose. He'd get to pulling that hay, and he'd get to pulling hard, and he didn't want to stop. And if I couldn't get him stopped, he'd pull the stake and the rope clear off the haystack, and then it was quite a job to get it back up there. And generally in the afternoon, about 2 o'clock, when it was real hot, we'd all go swimming. And Ivan and Kenny told me that I had to, we went to this one special hole in the river, and they said that you couldn't crawl in or wade in. The only way you could get into that swimming hole was to jump in. So then I bought all that stuff, and I jumped in, and I was way over my head. And that's the day I learned how to swim.
What's your best childhood memory?
Oh, gee, I used to do a lot of hunting and riding horses. And I remember when we moved down from Wyoming, we didn't have our saddle horses for, I suppose, a few months. And we used to have to go out and get the cattle and the milk cows and stuff. And I remember it was just terrible having to walk after them, after having access to a saddle horse. And I remember when we got them back, boy, we just rode them all the time, every place we went.
What's your worst or scariest childhood memory?
Well, I don't know. I guess one time out in Wyoming, we was there was two families of kids that was went to this one school, and I don't remember what the occasion was, but this one particular day, we took off across the river. It was in the spring of the year, and the river was flooding, and there was a big ice jam. And over across the river, there was an old well that had a bunch of quicksand around it. And we decided we was going to go down and cross this ice dam and check that place out over there. So we all went down. We went across this Belfouche River, and I suppose it was a quarter-mile wide where the jam was. We jumped across on these ice blocks all the way across, and then we came back. We got done over there, and we came back across it. We climbed up the side of the bank there. Probably got a half a mile or so from the river. We looked back, and the ice jam was all gone. It was all washed out. And if that had happened when we was out there in the middle of it, that would have been pretty scary.
Any other things?
Well, I remember, not to be topped by Uncle Ivan here, one time Dad went to town and he bought a big old boar. And it had tusks about 3 inches long that come right up out of its lower jaw. And Dad, I guess, probably put it in the pen, but Art and I at that time was feeding the hogs and milking the cows. And we had this hog shed, and as you walked in each compartment of the hog shed, there was 3 pens. There was one in the straight ahead and one off on each side, and they all had wooden gates in. Generally, when you put a hog in there, he was in there. And I went in there one day to feed these hogs, and that big old boar was off to my left in the pen, and I was feeding the one right in front of me, and that big old boar was asleep. And I kind of glanced over, and I saw that the bottom hinge was all broke out on his pen. And of course, we was really afraid of him. And just about that time, he woke up, and he came out. He hit that gate, and of course, the bottom hinge was off, and he was right on my tail. And of course, back in them days, we never crawled over a fence. We always just grabbed a fence post and slung our body over the top of the fence. And I remember I run, and I got a hold of the top of the fence post and slung my leg over, and his jaw just caught my pants just as I went over the fence. It just kind of pinched my skin a little bit even. I remember that.
Cool.
But that was the closest skull I ever had.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't want old Grandpa Burke. I want my grandpa.
This is George Boat. Okay. What do you remember?
About speaking
What
up,
do
but
you
that's right
remember
under your
about
chin.
your Grandpa Bo?
I don't remember Grandpa Bo at all. He passed away before I was born.
How about
I
your-
remember a lot of stories about him, but that's my personal, I don't remember him or Grandpa Burke, either one.
How about your Grandma Bo?
Grandma Bo, what I remember about Grandma Bo, she lived in a little house in Newell, and when we go over there, she always had cookies for us. And she make these little doilies, they call them, and she had a lot of them around, and she was quite tall, quite slender, and we go over there and sat. Her house was always just neat as a pin.
What about your Grandma Burke?
I remember about Grandma Burke, she always wore her hair. She had real long hair, and she'd wear it up, she'd braid it and then curl it up on top of her head, and a little bun on top. And when I first remember Grandma Burke, she lived in Belfouche, and we'd always stop over there, and she'd always have cookies for us. And then she moved to Vale, a little trailer house in the backyard. In the evening, she'd let that bun down and bring it across her shoulder, and it'd come clear down below her waist. She'd sit there and brush that for a good hour every evening.
Okay.
She always thought I picked on Dale, though. Dale was her favorite, and she always thought I picked on him.
What do you remember about your mother?
Mom was a special lady to me. She, of course, me and Dale were the babies of the family, and we did a lot of fishing and hunting and playing on the creek when we were little, and she'd get worried about us and send one of the older kids to find us, and we'd usually see them coming, and we knew they'd be mad because they had to walk down the creek to find us, and so we'd usually sneak around and get home before they did so she could protect us.
What do you remember about your father?
Well, one of my fondest memories as Dad was when I was about the 8th grade, and I just learned to drive, and I went with him in the summer. He sold woolen goods out in the northwestern part of South Dakota and clear up into North Dakota, and I traveled all summer and helped him drive, and he knew that country, he knew everybody. It's funny, he seemed to know every rancher that lived in that country, from Belfast to Bismarck, North Dakota and back. And he knew all the good fishing holes, so he usually timed the stops, so about 3 nights a week we'd have a good fishing hole to fish at night and catch our fish and cook them, and we had a real good summer that summer.
What's your best childhood memory?
Oh, probably fishing and playing on Cottonwood Creek at Vale.
What's your worst or scariest childhood memory?
Well, one of them, when we were kids, well, we lived in Vale. We moved into Vale. The family moved into Vale when I was 3, but we still had the farm, and in the summertime, the older kids stayed on the farm, and we'd go out, and I remember once we went out there swimming, its favorite swimming hole, and me and Dale was too little to swim at that time. I was probably 5 and he was about 2 or 3, and so we were playing in the riffle right above the swimming hole, and it was after they started irrigating, so the water was pretty swift, and I lost my footing, and down the swimming hole I went over my head, and Bryce happened to be standing up. They'd dive off of the bank. It was a pretty tall bank on the edge, and he just happened to see me go in. Well, he pulled me out. But if it hadn't been for Bryce up on that bank, I probably wouldn't have got pulled out. Next day, he took me down there and put me on his shoulders, and he'd walk out in the middle of that and then duck out from underneath him. He'd swim or drown, and I learned to swim that next day.
Okay, any other childhood moments you'd like to talk about?
Well, we did a lot of fishing, and when Dad rented the farm out and sold the farm, he kept about 14 or 18 acres, whatever it was, so we'd have a place to fish, and we spent a lot of time out there fishing. Some of my favorite times is out there fishing.
Okay, what do you remember about Kenny?
Well, Kenny was quite a little bit older than me, but I think Kenny liked me real well. He always, when he come home, well, he as I remember, it was either a black pickup or a little black car. He'd always take me with him out in the fields and wherever, and I remember one time we were going down just south of the house there to the farmhouse, and I was leaning out the window and looking at the cows or whatever, and the road had a little turn in it, and when he made that turn, well, door opened and out I rolled. He thought he'd kill me. But Kenny and me were buddies when I was little.
Yeah, that's...
You got that feather on your foot?
Yeah, she's got me wired here, take an electrocardiogram.
Maybe a dog.
We got to get Famous in here.
Here, she's getting ready to tell us.
Well, we got to get Famous in the picture. Because he's a Burke too, isn't he? Is this a Burke?
Yeah, he should.
This is famous. This is Jay Burke, and I'm Art Bowl. And we're going to talk about the Burke family, I guess. Burke family history, right?
I guess.
Your dad was Amory Burke, right?
Yes.
And my grandpa was Walter Burke,
Brother.
his brother.
And Earl.
Had Uncle Earl, and he stayed a bachelor till he was, what, 65 years old, and then married.
And then divorced.
Oh, they got a divorce. I went and stayed with old Uncle Earl, you know, back in 1950. And he had an old straw carpet on the floor. And he's going to change that. Somebody give him a new one, a used one. So we commenced to take up that old straw carpet and sweep the dirt that had accumulated underneath that. And I was trying to get it real clean. He says, "Now, Art, don't get it too clean. We got to leave a little for seed," he said. And he had an old pea pot under the bed we had to use. Back in the old days before they had running water there.
Kerosene lamps.
Yeah. Now, didn't they have a sister, too, them boys?
2 sisters, and they was never well.
What was their names? Do you remember? Ruby's mother was one of them, right?
Yeah.
You don't know her name? What was the old people's name?
Ed and Laura.
Ed was Grandpa, huh? And
Your
Laura.
great-grandpa.
Uh-huh.
Where did they come from? And what?
Well, Grandpa, he lived in Kansas or someplace, and he was out there when that, what was that famous gangster? The James brothers.
Oh yeah,
was
Jesse
out there.
James.
And he had a farm there. And he sold that farm and come back east with a team of horses. And he was so scared of that Jesse James, or the brothers there, and he said the sheriff went out to get him one morning, and they brought him into camp, the sheriff, and he knew he had him. He's a high sheriff. That's what they call him. And so when they brought him into camp, they had target practice with him. Reached in their boots and just shot him to pieces. And Grandpa never went along with that kind of stuff. So he, one morning there's an restaurant eating, and a guy come in there and sit down and eat with him, with another sheriff. And that guy said, "Isn't he a fine guy?" He said, "Who is he?" And after he left, see, and so he said, "That was Jesse James." And that guy said, "Why didn't you tell me so I could have got him?"
Was that right?
He said, "No, I didn't want to tell you because he'd have killed you right there."
Huh.
Yeah.
Well,
But-
now, they came out of Kansas, but how about his parents and stuff?
Well, they were from home, from up in where we're at.
All from Indiana. They came from Indiana out to Kansas.
Yeah.
And then went back to Indiana.
Yeah, that's right. And
Okay, then further back in the family tree, did they? Now, what nationality were they?
well, I think they,
English.
Bratton, that was Laura, Grandma Burke was English.
Danish.
English.
English. Oh yeah.
And Grandpa Burke, he was sort of mixed up, but he had a lot of German in him. And he went through high school when he was a young guy, and he had a pretty good education, and he knew how to save money. When he died, you know, he was pretty wealthy.
Yeah.
He's like Dwight over there.
Now
And-
Walter said he was quite a bit Irish.
Well, yes, there was Irish in him.
Yeah.
They'd fight to drop your hat.
Well, that Burke name, is that, that'd be English or Irish, I suppose, huh?
And German, it's all mixed up.
Well, Burke is not a German name, though.
Well, no, but there's
Yeah.
German in him.
Yeah.
And,
I never would claim that because I've always been a little prejudiced against Germans.
well, don't bring it up anymore.
Theodore said nobody wants to claim the German. He said they're all hard-headed Germans.
Oh, boy, them Burks hard.
Oh, is that right?
I mean, they were stubborn. They couldn't get along with nobody. And there's always a fight.
You got any stories about them old brothers?
No, I don't care to tell.
Huh?
No, I ain't gonna tell.
No, them old Walter and Emery and them, Earl, didn't they they was a feuding all the time, weren't they?
They had
worked on
lots.
the railroad, right? Walter worked
Walter
on the
worked
railroad.
on the railroad, and the other boys helped farm. Helped Grandpa farm on his farm.
What railroad company did they work for?
Big Four.
Big Four.
Yeah. And after that, when I come up, they wanted to make me a railroad detective, and they hired me. The old chief come out of Cincinnati, and hired me to be a railroad detective. And so when I was going to take the job and everything, went up and met the old sergeant at Anderson, and he said, boy, you're going to be sent into East St. Louis, and you'll love that.
East St.
My wife
Louis?
was with me, yeah. And my wife was with me, my first wife, and he said, they have a killing there 2 and 3 times a week. And my wife went hysterical, and we lost a baby over it.
Oh,
And
really?
I never took the job. I quit.
Huh.
I quit before it got started.
Huh.
But that railroad, that was a pretty good job. All I had to do was sit all night and guard the box cars and run the guys off of there. It was a riding. It was pretty rough.
Okay, this farm that your dad grew up on, where's that at from what town?
Lapel, and it was south of Lapel,
How far south of LaPel?
about 3.5 miles.
Oh, is that right? Right
Yeah.
close to LaPel, Indiana.
Well,
Yeah.
now that's right there at Hardscrabble, isn't it?
Yes.
Right by the
Well,
Hardscrabble
they
store?
lived back
Or is that a
there where
different
we
one?
lived first, and
Oh.
then Grandpa bought that 60 up there.
Oh, by
That's what
Hardscrabble.
Uncle
Huh?
Walter got
Oh.
when he passed on.
Mm-hmm.
And them Burks was very hard-headed,
Well, now, were they kind of a peculiar outfit?
very peculiar. My dad would go to the back end of the farm, and by the time he got back, he had a fight.
Oh.
And one time we was out coon hunting, and Dad run into these guys a coon hunting director on him, and he didn't like them, and he told them to get their dog and get out. Well, they couldn't catch the dog soon enough to suit Dad. Dad caught that dog and cut its head off right on the stump.
Oh, Jesus.
Oh, yeah. And he didn't take no lip off of anybody. And he'd go to the polls on when they voted, you know.
Election day.
Yeah. And you could see him, he'd have his horse and buggy, and he'd drive it to the back end of the farm. And you'd see him go out the back gate. He'd leave Mom at home. She's a Democrat.
Yeah.
And he'd leave her home, and he'd take off for Ingalls, a little town down there where they voted. He'd stay there all day and fight. And he was such a radical Republican. And my mom was just as radical Democrat. As soon as she seen him, she'd have us boys watching him. When he left, she'd have a neighbor come in and take her to the polls. And that's the way they voted. Yeah,
Canceled each other out, huh?
canceled each other out. But one would try to sneak around and beat the other one, thinking they wasn't going to vote this time, see? And they'd both end up voting. I was a strong Republican, and then they got to starving us out. Now I vote the straight Democrat ticket.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah,
What a shame.
yeah.
You do not. What? What was that? What was that story you told me about that neighbor of yours?
My
The
neighbor,
Democrats, or what was that story? You remember that? You telling me that.
did he drink or what? I don't remember.
Maybe I'll remember it after a bit.
Tell about the pig you raised and your dad butchered it.
Oh, yeah. I worked for Uncle Earl, and when we got the summer over, he didn't have no money to pay me, so he said, Junie, go out there and catch you a pig. I went out there and I caught me a spotted pig and carried it a mile home. Got it home and put it in the hen house and fed it slop, you know. And then later, after it got bigger, oh, you could rub her belly and she'd just lay out, you know, and when she was a regular pet. Turned her out in the cornfield, and she'd eat all the time out there. She got real big pig. And so one morning I was standing upstairs looking through the window, and Dad had an awful fire started out there. Steam was coming up, you know, and everything. And I thought, well, I wonder what he's going to do this morning. And boy, and little bitty, hooey, piggy, piggy. Called the pig up there, my pig now, mind you. And boy, he hit that thing in the head with an axe and didn't cut its throat. And he butchered my pig that morning. Boy, it broke my heart. I'd worked all summer and he ate my pig. Oh yeah, but he had put that meat in a barrel and then salt it real good. Oh, they'd salt that down, and Mom never learned how to take that salt out of that.
You ate the salt too then?
Oh yes, and your lips would just be raw, and your tongue. I don't like ham yet today. Yeah. Poor old Mom done the best she could, but it just wasn't quite good enough, you know. Another time, I'll tell you a little story about my first wife. We was over in Lapel one day, and my dad, he told me not to let her on my little scooter. I had a little motor outfit, and me and old Kenny would get on that thing, and boy, it would just go slow, wouldn't know how to go. My wife come out there, and she's pretty smart, and she said, oh, if that's all the faster it goes, I'll ride it. And we said, no, Dad said to keep you off. Well, we don't care what Dad said. I'm going to ride it. And she got on there, and we showed her how to turn the gas on, you know. We didn't think she'd go very fast. And boy, that thing broke loose some way, and you never seen a little motorbike run so fast in your life. And we forgot to tell her how to shut it down, you know. And so she made the first corner all right. She went a block and went to make the next corner, and she didn't get around it. And it just took all the skin off of her legs and everything, and I didn't even know. And I said, Dad, come out there. And he said, what do you do? I said, put my wife on the scooter. She wanted to ride. And he said, well, where's she at? And I said, I don't know. I said, you seen when she left? He said, yeah. If she come back as fast as she left, said, she'd do in here anytime. But here come a little kid. He said, hey, there's a lady laying over there against the curb bleeding awful bad. I forget what that cost me to take her to the doctor, just by putting her on there. But my dad figured that out all himself.
Have you ever had any experience with buck sheep?
Yes, we have.
Huh?
Pet bucks.
Buck?
Whenever you have a buck sheep and he's a pet, he's the meanest thing you ever saw. He gets ornery. And
well, you had one that you didn't have any trouble catching. There seems a story about that.
Yeah. My first father-in-law wanted to buy a buck sheep, a white face one. And I said, I'll look up the shop. I run into a big guy up there, and he said, by George, I've got one of them. And I said, what are you asking for? And he said, $25. And so I went home and told my father-in-law about it, and he said, Jay, he said, let's go to Honey Creek. That's where he's from. Let's go to Honey Creek and get that sheep. So I said, all right. And so we went over there, and that big guy come out, and when we went through the gate, he picked up a gate of his own he had. And I thought, wonder what he's going to do with that gate. And we thought he was going to pin that sheep with that gate. We went out there in that old bank barn, and when we went in there, there he stood, and he just looked like a picture standing there. Grandpa said, what did you say you wanted for him? He said, $25. Well, any time you bought a sheep like that, it's worth right smart more, you know. And so Grandpa said, I'll just take that, and he paid him, and he said, I'll go get the truck and while you catch him. And I said, all right. So I got all humped over trying to catch that sheep. You didn't have to catch him. He just reared up like that, turned his head and looked me in the eye, and come at me 40 miles an hour. And so when he did, I just stepped aside and grabbed him by the hair and threw him down. And so here come Grandpa back. Said, you caught him already? And I said, I sure did. And so he said, had his truck up there, and we backed up to the barn, or he did. And he said, we'll just put him in the truck. And I never took my hands off of him. I kept right a hold of that sheep. And so he put a rope around his neck and tied him to the front end of the truck. And we was going home, and I said, Grandpa, I think you bought a mean sheep. Oh, he said, you're not a farm boy. He said, that's the reason you don't know too much. He says, you can tell when it's mean. We're looking at it. And that's not mean. I said, well, you know more about it than I do. I don't know nothing about it. So we stopped on the way home, and that damn thing and butted the bed of that truck till his nose was bleeding, you know. So when we got home, I said, what do you want to do with him, Grandpa? He said, we'll put him in this shed here, corn crib on each side, had a gate across the shed, about that big. So put him in there so I can water him and feed him, you know. So we put him in there, and when we got him in there, I said, Grandpa, you got him safe, and, you know, in there. He said, yeah. He said, you can go home now. So I got home, and hadn't in the morning got home till Grandma called. Said, get over here right quick, Jay. And I said, what's the matter? Said, Grandpa was in there spreading the hay around, and he said, he was all bent over, And you know that buck sheep hit him and knocked him over that gate, and he's still laying out there. So I had to go back and help Grandpa. But that sheep was so mean, you had to carry a baling wire with you when you went out in the field. And if he come to you, catch him, put that baling wire on him, lead him over and tie him to the fence, and then go down to the next post. Because if you didn't, he'd hit your leg that you was trying to get over with, and you couldn't stand up. He'd just keep hitting you, know. Just feel like a bunch of rocks hitting you. So he finally got done with him, we sold him. But he was a mean sheep. And I think I'm done. Now you tell something.
Well, the first time I met Jay and his brother Carol and Kenny and then there's Lester and Jerry, right? But the first time I met him was 1950. I went out to spent the summer there in Indiana. And Jay, he was awful good to me that summer. He had two little children, preschoolers, and you were the cop then in Pendleton, weren't you? Policeman, sheriff, marshal, town marshal, and you were probably what, 27 years old, 26, something like that.
25.
Young, big, old, strapping guy, but he was awful nice to me. Him and his brother Carol, and they took me a fishing trip to Monticello, Indiana. And they had another friend with them too. But they brought a lot of food. But everywhere I go fishing, I get awful hungry. I think I ate all the food before we ever got located there too well. But we all four slept in a tent that night. And these guys is fond of snake stories, rattlesnake stories and that. And we laid in that tent till midnight, I think, telling snake stories, and I don't think either him or Carol slept then all night. They thought a big old python was going to come out of that river and eat them. But we had some good times and good memories, and all through the years we've had some good reunions, and Jay's told some good stories. So.
You ready to turn it off?
Yeah. Well, if you guys are all done talking, we need to get Dale.
I'm all done. How do you shut it off?
Norman needs to talk.
It just won't shut off, Jay.
Oh, mercy. That's my luck. That's been that way all my life.
Well,
That'll be wonderful.
Well, thank you for the stories, Jay.
Well, thank you for letting me give it.
And our grandkids will be able to look at, our great-grandchildren be able to know old Jay Burke now and some of his stories, and that's
Get her over here as quick as you can.
pull the battery off, take it out.
So let's shut it off.
Get on the road. Yeah.
Thank you. Like the moon soccer. And your name is Diane. I don't know if that's good. What is it? This is Leanne and Ryan. What's your last name? You have a daughter that goes back there. Oh, do you really? Who's that? Oh, you do? Your daughter? Yeah. Okay, you got it.
Okay, this is Norman and Dale. What do you think about what do you remember about your Grandma Bo?
Not very much.
How about you?
I remember that she lived in a little house over at Newell, And I used to go over and stay with her, and she wouldn't let me play with the kids across the street because they were too ornery.
And she had a Dutch oven out in the north side of the house in the shade that she always had Norwegian pastries in, and whenever we went over, she went out and got Dad and I a Norwegian pastry out of that Dutch oven.
What do you remember about your Grandpa Bo?
Nothing.
I don't either.
What about your Grandma Bert?
Her baby was Dale Bow, and she treated him really good, and she spoiled him rotten. And I really liked her.
How about you?
She was real ornery to me. I didn't like her very well. I remember that.
What about your Grandpa Bert?
I don't remember, never knew him.
I remember him a little bit. Mainly, I remember when he was real sick and just before he died. I can remember that, and that's about all I remember of him. I was real small.
What do you remember about your mother?
What do I remember about mine? Well, I remember she was sick a lot when we were. She had a bad heart, and she'd have to rest about half the day when she was up. And I remember us kids would help her with the dishes, and I remember when she was resting, she'd lay down in the bed, and we'd sit on the bed and visit with her. That's what I remember.
Do you remember anything?
Oh, just a few things. I remember one time her being in bed and me smoking a cigar, and her getting up and coming in the other room, me throwing a cigar in a bathtub full of water.
What do you remember about your father?
I remember a lot about Dad because I was 15 when he died, and I was down and spent about a month with him summer before he died, and we just spent about 3 weeks just running around Tucson having a good time. So.
How about you?
I remember my dad always took me fishing. We used to go out on Horse Creek. I remember in particular one time we went and I walked down the bank, and he just got me a new cane pole, and I went down the bank and I threw it out in and caught a big catfish, about that big, and I run up the bank and dragged him out. I remember that. I was so excited. Once I seen him, I just turned around and took off running, and he never got the worm, so I threw out in another and grabbed it, and I did the same thing with him, and here I come with these two big old catfish. I left the cane pole and I went to show Dad, and he thought maybe I'd got in somebody's set lines. He couldn't believe that I'd caught them two big catfish that quick.
What's the best childhood memory?
I think probably fishing with Dad, because Dad loved to fish, and if you're a boy growing up and you have a good catfish hole like Horse Creek was, we spend an awful lot of time out there fishing with Dad and camping and stuff, and I think that's probably the best one.
How about you?
Pardon?
How about you? What's your best childhood memory?
Oh, I guess probably fishing too would have probably been. We did a lot of fishing all through our childhood.
What's your worst or scariest childhood memory?
Go ahead, Norm.
Mine probably was when my mother passed away. When was probably my scariest, I would say.
How about you?
Yeah, I suppose that'd probably be mine too.
Well, what do you remember about Kenny Bo?
I remember him on one birthday bringing me a little toy pistol, and then I remember him on another birthday coming with a card and a $1 bill, which a $1 bill was a lot of money to me then. And I remember him being in uniform, and he was a pretty special brother, and I remember that uniform really impressed me when he was in the service.
How about you?
I probably remember him better when I was small out on the farm more than in town. I think I probably saw him more then. He was around a lot. And he was really a good big brother. I remember one time he had a plug of tobacco and he gave me a chew and I got awful sick. I remember that.
Well, thank you.
Is that it?
Is there anything else that you'd like to say? Any other experiences or?
Well, this has been a really nice reunion. I think the brothers probably had more time to visit this year because we all stayed in one spot here and didn't move around.
Yeah, I think so too.
It's just been a real special.
I think it was probably one of my better.
Real special reunion.
I like steak. I want to buy a cabinet. Well, Ragnar Bow here. He's about the oldest Bow in the family now, right, Ragnar?
That's right.
Walter's probably next.
Yeah, it could be.
Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit about when you was young and what you remember about some of that and some of the older people in the family, your parents and our grandparents.
Yeah.
Your dad's name was
Ole.
Ole. And my granddad's name was Lewis.
Yeah.
And then their wives were sisters too, right?
Yeah. So we were double cousins.
So you double cousins.
Yeah.
And then Louis and Ole, there was about how many people in that family?
Well, there was 13 kids at one time.
Can you remember the names?
No, I don't, because they lived in Wisconsin. 3 of them died of smallpox when they lived in Wisconsin.
Oh, is that right? No, that's something I didn't remember.
And their dad drowned in the Mississippi River, attempting to cross it.
Yeah, that was a Prairie du Chien, right?
Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin.
Yeah.
And
that was about 1849, right?
Well, no, after that, because my dad was born in 56, and about about the time that he drowned would have been about
late 1850s.
They come to South Dakota in 1876, so it was before that. About 1870 or along there.
Well, I thought they came to
Elk Point.
Elk Point before that.
Well,
they came to the Black Hills in '78, right?
Yeah, they came to the Black Hills then after the grasshoppers cleaned them up 3 years in a row. And they started for the hills. They loaded some of that stuff on a steamboat at Elk Point, and we were going to take it off at Fort Pier and go across country. But the steamboat caught fire, and they lost a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
And the way how they got to the hills, other than but Andrew Bow was the oldest of the bunch. He and Pete Edwards walked from Fort Pier to Rapid City, and trying to get lined up on some of the stuff they lost in the fire, I suppose. I don't know. But anyway, they come to the hills in 1878 or 9.
Yeah.
And they landed in Rapid City and built a log cabin there. But they didn't stay there long. They went north and they tried their luck at panning gold. That didn't seem like that was going to be anything. So they went out on Willow Creek and filed on claims over on Willow Creek and Horse Creek. And that's how they got in there.
Now they put up hay and hauled it into Deadwood.
Yeah, they put up hay and hauled it into Deadwood before the railroad come and took a lot of hay for all them drays coming in their horses. Yeah. And they'd get $40 for a rack full of good wild hay, you know.
Oh, $40 back then?
Yeah.
A lot of money.
Yeah, it was then. Yeah.
Yeah, the railroad came in there when in the 90s, probably.
1889 or 90.
Yeah.
And their hay business was over in a hurry.
Yeah.
The railroad kept coming to...
Did any of them work in the homestake at that time?
No, not that I ever remembered him saying. I never did. I think Pete Edwards did.
Yeah.
He was married to one of their sisters, you know.
Now, Pete Edwards, how is he related? He's related through Marcella, right? To Marcella.
No, that's a different Edwards.
Oh, that's a different Edwards.
See, Pete Edwards was married to my dad's sister.
Oh, Pete Edwards.
He was a brother-in-law.
Okay, well that's how we're related then to the Edwards.
That's how you're related to Liv Edwards in that way, yeah.
How about the Christoffersons?
Christoffersons, their granddad was Louis Thompson, and his name But it's hard to figure out. I asked my uncle in Norway when we were there in 1970. He said that Louis Thompson was an uncle to his mother. Now, how far did that go? How could you explain that?
Okay, so then that relation goes clear back to Norway.
Yeah, it goes back to Norway.
Okay, so that's back 100 years, 150 years probably.
Yeah.
Oh, good, that's right.
They had quite an experience with filing on claims out there in that country and they built first they lived in a dugout to begin with over there on Willow Creek, and that was before either of them were married, Louis or Ole. Andrew was married when he was young.
Yeah.
That's why Rogue and George and that bunch they were old enough to be our uncles, not full cousins.
Now was Roger and Liv's, or not Roger, but Roger and Les's dad, his name was Andrew?
Andrew.
Okay.
His name was Andrew. And you see, they when they come to, they got their mail mixed up. Their name was really Lewis, you see, but they changed it to Bo. And Andrew Bo was the one that done that when they come to South Dakota. They changed it to Bo to do away with that mail mix-up on Lewis. So they changed it to Bo.
I thought it was Bo over in Norway.
And named after a Bo farm in Norway.
Yeah.
That's where they got the Bo name. I've understood.
Well, okay, the way I understood it, there was an Oya that married a Bo girl, and they lived on the Bo farm, so they took the Bo name. Now, that's the way Walter and Thelma have it figured out.
Well, I've heard that too.
From over in over in Norway, they've talked to the...
That's where they got the Bo name was from a Bo farm in Norway, which was a rather an unusually big farm for Norway.
Okay, well, now you was born in what year, Ragnar? Then
1906.
1906. Well, that was about the time old Roger Bo was bringing the big cattle drives into this country.
He was in the big cattle drives.
1904, 5, and 6, I think.
Involved with Ed Lemon.
Where they brought in about 10,000 head of cattle and trailed them in a couple of years from Texas and Arizona. And then one year they brought in a big trail drive from Washington and Oregon.
Yeah.
And
I heard that too.
Rover used to tell me all them tales.
Yeah.
And he said that they kind of come over in the spring of the year. They did this big drive. And he said that nearly every time they swam across a big stream, they'd lose a man.
Yeah.
And he says that they'd start dragging cattle into the river with lariats about before daylight in the morning, and they'd still be swimming cattle across after dark at night.
Yeah, it was a terrible job to get them across.
Across them flooding rivers. Like said they lost a man up in Miles City coming across the Yellowstone there.
Oh, I wouldn't wonder. Yeah, that could be. I think I've heard Rogue tell some of them tales too.
Yeah. Now Les Bo, one of Les Bo's sons or son-in-laws was a rodeo contestant here not too long ago. Are you aware of that?
His son-in-laws?
Well, either his grandson, probably. Grandson.
It could be because he had the two girls all he had.
He had a grandson that was up in close to the national champion in saddle bronc riding, I think.
Yeah, that could be.
What do you know about that Les's grandson, his rodeo?
I don't know anything about that.
Well, so one of the brothers was telling me about that. I don't remember. Maybe it's Dale. Ask Dale if he knows anything about that. Dale? Do you know anything about Les Bo's grandson, his rodeo?
You would know.
Being involved in the rodeo?
Do I know anything about what?
About Les Bo's grandson being a rodeo championship contestant here
recently?
Well, the last 10 years or so.
No.
Somebody told me he was right up there in the world championship rankings.
Oh, I can believe that. I know that whole bunch. This Sonny Moore that I met was one of his great grandkids, or excuse me, one of Babe's.
That's pretty neat, I think.
And he was quite a rodeoer. He just died. He lived up to them.
That's Babe.
Babe's grandson.
Oh yeah, that's the other.
Moore is his name, Sonny Moore.
Yeah.
But he was quite a rodeoer in his day. But he just died here. He lived up them.
I can't remember who told me that, but somebody told me he was right up there in the rankings.
No,
He'd been one of Les's grandsons.
Was Andrew Bow in the state legislation?
He was.
Yeah, and when it was in Dakota Territory.
Yeah.
Well,
I thought that was 1967.
You mean 57?
Or 1867.
Yeah, 1867. That could have been. I've heard that he was in the legislature before it became a state.
Yeah, it was Dakota Territory.
Yeah.
And there was some tale about part of Wyoming was in it or something. There was a big squabble about getting, Wyoming wanted to get out of it, and somehow they did, I guess. They didn't want people over here telling them how to run things over there.
Yeah, well, it's quite a deal. As far as Christopherson boys here now, I can see a resemblance, an awful strong resemblance in what's Bob? It's Bob, ain't it here?
Yes.
I can see a strong resemblance in him and Louis Thompson.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. He sure got some of his granddad's traits.
One thing I wanted to ask you is, did Andrew Bow homestead in this area? And if he did,
he homesteaded out on Pine Creek, northeast of Sulphur. That's where that was.
Yeah.
And Stumproot or somebody like that's got that land in there now. They tell me that ranch.
Oh, I'll be joking.
That's where
somebody said that the Indians used to come in there and beg for food.
Yeah.
The nomadic Indians coming through the country.
Well, they told about they done that right there with my grandmother right there in the house. She was home alone, and the Indians come. They wanted sugar. And she'd give them all the sugar they had, and they was tickled to death. She wanted to get rid of them. She was scared of them. She was home alone, and a bunch of Indians stopping, you know. Of course, that was the first.
Horse Creek?
Yeah, first part of the 80s, probably. 1880s.
Was they living in dugouts at that time?
No, they never lived in dugout until they built the first part of that old house there.
Yeah. But down there in the riverbank of Horse Creek, all over there, about a quarter mile from there, where the county line went down and run into Horse Creek, there was a couple old dugouts there.
Yeah, well,
and I heard that they lived in that while they built, the first year or two that they was there.
They built a house. They built the tall part of that house. That was before either one of them were married, of course.
Oh, is that right?
Louis and Ole, your granddad and my dad,
and
living there with their mother. But they lived over on Willow Creek in a dugout. But they built that house on Horse Creek, where it sits now. Pretty shortly after that, because they didn't live in the dugout too long, the way I understood it. Anyway, Susan's grandmother, they told about her just leaving the dugout and steps down into it, and she went out for a walk, and she come back, and there's a big rattlesnake laying down there against the door. Well,
yeah.
She had quite a time getting rid of the rattlesnake before she get in the dugout.
Yeah.
Anyway, she was a spunky old gal. She soon fixed the rattlesnake. She was a spunky old gal. From what they tell about her, she would walk from the place there to Whitewood with a mail sack, like a flour sack, and walked away 18 miles from there, straight across the river and the creek, and go on up there through Vale and up straight across to Whitewood, and 18 miles to Whitewood. She would walk that.
What did she go to Whitewood for?
Oh, that's where they got their mail.
Oh, okay.
She wanted that mail. She would go to Whitewood, she'd pick up a few things, and there was somebody that she stayed with that she knew. Next day she'd walk back.
Yeah.
That's the story that told on her, but she was.
Now is that Ole's mother?
Yeah, Aunt Louie's mother.
Yeah.
Let's bring that back here so we can get you.
Now how old was she been at that time?
Well, she died when she was in her 80s. She died when she was in her 80s, and at the time she was They said that she was 65 years old and she was walking to Whitewood 18 miles and 18 miles back.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
With groceries and their mail, whatever there would be.
She was had a lot of spunk to that old gal. She's the first one that was buried in the Wilson Cemetery.
Oh, yeah.
She died in 1902. But she wouldn't have died then. She fell down that old trap cellar way down in the cellar underneath the house, and she fell down that and broke her hip and just laid there and got pneumonia, you know.
Yeah. And how old was she when she died?
Well, I think she was past her 82nd birthday, probably 84 or 5.
Yeah.
But she would live a lot longer than that. She hadn't had that happen to her.
You almost need the record book to know the exact date. What was her birth date? I never remember. He does.
I don't remember her birth date.
Okay, now there's somebody said that Lewis played the violin or the fiddle. Do you remember any of that?
Never did. I never knew him to, but he could have. He didn't when I grew up.
Yeah.
Of course, by the time I grew up to remember, there's been a lot of things happen. Because I can remember back as far as 1911. As far as I can remember, and that was a special deal, or I wouldn't remember that.
Yeah.
They just put the irrigation in there on the lower end of Indian Creek Valley, you know, that land across the creek there.
Yeah.
And there was the water coming, and they were getting ready for it, and there was a new ditch. And I remember looking against the sun, and you could see that water coming down. That was the first water to come down that ditch.
Oh, is that right?
In 1911.
Now, was Ormond Dam built that time?
Oh, yeah, that's where the water come from. They'd finished the Ormond Dam in 1909.
Yeah, at the time that was built, that was the largest earth-filled dam in the world, they said.
Oh, yeah, and look how they built it with steam shovel and team and wagons.
Slips.
My dad helped on that.
Oh, is that right?
With his team and just one of those scoops. What do they call them?
They call them
Slips. That's what he used.
Fresnos and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of history connected with it. See, when they built Norman Dam the 22nd of July, 1906, they got a cloudburst. Well, they had all them teams tied down there, big feed racks, and had the harness off of them, and they unhitched from them wagons. And this gosh darn rain come up and flooded, and it washed about all the dirt out that they'd put in there, and they lost all their harness and wagons, but they didn't lose any horses.
Oh.
They had quite a deal getting wagons lined up because they lost most of them.
Oh, right.
When they get to pushing wagons backwards, you know, the birds screw off and the wheels come off. And they drop in some hole someplace and fill up with that mud. They said a lot of them wagons were probably right down there in some of them holes, but washed all that mud down there and covered them up.
Yeah.
We have elementary school from kindergarten to 6th grade. Then we have middle school from 7th grade to 8th grade. Then we have high school.
Oh, you guys don't have junior high?
Maybe good.
Okay, well, Mary Carlson is here someplace. Mary?
I'm camera shy.
Yeah, come over. You can come here and sit if you want to.
You come over and watch. This is a special.
Oh, hi. Okay, we're here with Mary. And what do you know about the Bow family?
What do I know about the Bow family? Well, they're a wonderful bunch of people, but I don't want to brag too much because I'm a Bow.
Okay. Tell me about some of your experiences with the Bow family.
With the Bow family?
Yes, like back when you were children.
Back in the old days, right?
Well, I didn't know the Bows when I was a little girl. The way I met the Bows was that my mother, who was a Bow, descendant, used to correspond with Aunt Dora, who's Ragner's mother. And when my mother died, I started corresponding with her. But I lost my address book, and I didn't remember the name, I didn't know addresses or anything. And then years later, I came across a sympathy card that Ragnar and Marcella had sent to me when my mother died. So that was Leela Trebelcox, and I made a long-distance call right then to Spearfish, South Dakota, and I talked to Marcella and Ragnar, and I'd never met them, never talked to them. So at Christmas time, they invited me to come to the reunion, which was going to be in Spearfish the next year. So I came, and I met all the Bows, and I found out a lot about my great-grandmother My grandmother didn't tell me any stories about the bows.
So you don't know any stories?
I learned it all from the folks here in Spearfish.
So tell me some stories.
Some stories? Well, some things I've heard. My grandmother was Mary Bow Berkman, and she's one of the children that came with grandmother Mary Bow from Norway. She was born in Norway. And I've been to Norway to visit my husband's family, and I didn't know that my family came from Norway. So I'm ready to go back to Norway so that I can visit the Bow farm.
Can you talk Norwegian?
No. No. My grandmother never taught me any Norwegian. My mother-in-law used to talk Norwegian, but I never.
Forgot it all.
You forgot it all?
I used to know some nursery rhymes. I can go through about 2 lines of one, and the rest of it I got out of all of it.
No, I never learned any Norwegian. My grandmother only lived with us for a few years in Oklahoma. The rest of my family was born in South Dakota, but my mother and father moved to Oklahoma, and I was born in Oklahoma. So I'm the only member of my family who came from Oklahoma.
Well, your mother wrote all the time, and they would sit and read them letters. Lila Trebelcock letter, that was pretty important.
Well, Mother enjoyed corresponding with the folks here, and she told me, I used to hear her talking about Deadwood and Lead, but I never knew much about them. So I've enjoyed visiting some of the places that I've heard about. But she didn't really tell me any stories. Yes, ma'am. That's the microphone.
What did your parents do in Oklahoma?
My father was in the lead and zinc mines. We lived in Miami, and
Grandma.
Just a moment, dear. The mines were northeast of Miami, but all the work done in tempering the steel was done above ground. And so I've only been down in a mine once. I went down with a teachers' convention after I was working in the high school, but it wasn't the fancy contraption that they had at the mining museum in Lead. This was like a big can, and they just lowered you in the ground. It was a little scary.
How are you related?
How am I related? Well, my mother is the daughter of Mary Bow Berkman.
But you live in Washington, D.C.
Well,
Okay, Mary. Here we are on television again. Okay, you was born in Oklahoma.
in Miami, Oklahoma.
In Miami, is that north of Oklahoma City or south or?
It's northeast. It's in the very northeast corner of Oklahoma.
Oh yeah.
About 25 miles from the Missouri line, about 25 miles from the Kansas line, in the lead and zinc mining area. Used to be the largest lead and zinc mining area in the world.
Okay, and then you left that country when you were about how old?
I left Miami.
Yeah, you left Oklahoma.
I was 19, and I went to work in Washington, D.C.
Okay, and you went to work, and that's where you met Roger.
Mm-hmm. After the war.
After World War
II.
II.
Not the Civil War.
Okay, well, we're talking about some old times here, so we want to get this straight.
World War II. And he'd come back from service in the Navy, and I had worked for the government.
Grandma.
And I stayed with the government for 30 years, and then I retired from the government.
Everybody come see us if you can.
I retired from the government, and we had a dry cleaning business, which Roger had been operating. So I worked with him for 10 years in the dry cleaning business. And then in 1980, we sold the business and retired. And that's the same year that we came to the first bow reunion in 1980.
Well,
it was here in Spearfish.
I sure got a surprise when she called. and mentioned Leela Tabelka. It sure surprised me.
Because you remember the name, right?
Well, yeah, she told me who she was, and she says, I'm a daughter of Leela Tabelka. Gee whiz. We got letters from her for years. My mother used to answer them. And then sit and read them letters from Leela Tabelka. When you said Leela Tabelka, it sure rang a bell.
And I corresponded with Aunt Dora for a number of years.
Yeah.
Yeah, that could have been. I suppose
We've
we
corresponded
listened to
with
some of the letters you wrote.
Have you corresponded with any of them?
No, I don't. No, I've never had any contact.
Uncle Dave and his family, you know, and we still hear from their one daughter that we met was in their home. We still hear from her, but of course, this Uncle Dave has passed on, and now and Osborne, I guess is how they pronounced her name. She's gone too. So.
Now, where does she live?
They lived in Bergen.
Oh, this is what you're talking about in Norway now.
Yeah, on mother's side.
We visited them there in Norway, and was in their home, and it was interesting. And we visited their daughter, husband, and family in Norway. You remember that? I don't even remember his name, how to pronounce it in the first place. You were here when he was here from Norway.
Oh yes.
He was just about 4 years old when we were over there, so it was, you know, it was kind of a shock to see that kid out here running around across the United States. But anyway, that's his folks were the parents that was Dave's and Osborne's daughter.
How do you spell that name? Do you know?
Her first name.
Yeah.
Let's see
and
if
the
I
last
can.
name too.
Just the way it sounds, Osborne. Well, I know.
O-S-B-U-R-G?
No, A-U-G-S-B-O-R-G, I believe it is. Osborne. I have it at home, and if I'd known this was going on, I would have, you know, brought that so we could. But it's like Ragnar's aunt. Never knew for sure how to pronounce your grandmother's first her name and pronounce it correctly. Remember?
Well, it's 10 minutes to 1, and I'm told by the people that rented the spaces here that we have to.
My daughter's girlfriend had twin boys, and she's like, "Oh, I'm so glad that didn't happen to me. I would have had to put one in the basement and one upstairs. Maybe both of them downstairs with a nanny." So,
don't do anything now. I'm walking over here.
That's right. Oh! Isn't it? Wonderful. Well, you were supposed to. I know, but I mean, I thought you said there's horses. But I said, well, can I have some? What was it?
I always say.
Hey, Bob, smile.
For me? That thing won't work after you get me on it for a while.
I wish I could do that.
Do you know what you're doing there?
Yeah, my wife teaches television production, see, so.
Do you have a time setting? Does that have intervals where it takes pictures? Or?
No, it's just continuous.
Already.
Hey, Jeannie. Jeannie.
Hi, how are you?
Just fine, thank you. But I will probably be doing better if we can get all of our cousins together so Mother would take her picture. But he's taking a picture there.
It's wonderful seeing you. And they just look like a bunch of our here, but I want some of them. Just get them.
Hey, Patsy. Big smile.
You got Gwenny here. I'm sorry.
No, that's only very special people may call me that. Because Rob hates us, and we call him Robbie.
Okay, Gwenny, big smile.
And everyone's happy. That's Bryce. That's acceptable. Because they kind of just we really know. So what are you going to do?
Come on, Bryce. How many people?
Four. Willow and Bryce.
Okay, now why did the light go out?
Oh, because it's ready. Yeah. But, I mean, because it just stays on a certain length of time. But we want to bring
How you want to spend it? Together?
Yes, it does. It's just going to take the glass across.
Do you want me to get closer? I can.
You want to?
Well,
That's a little far away.
well, let me take it this way.
Okay.
Then let me take it closer up.
Okay. It might have to be adjusted then, huh? Just look at the lines on her blouse and see if it's lined up.
If they're straight up and down, it's okay. If they're crossways, it's in trouble.
And then you turn.
The outside thing?
I can't remember if it's inside or out. It's probably the outside, yes. I think the inside is for the... By the time you're taking pictures of little children, by the time you get ready, they're gone. Now you're Ivan's watch. That's what I thought. Okay, now we got to get the part.
Bring it back, and now I'm in the...
Guys, come over here and take some pictures. You guys are we're way up. Okay.
We don't want you to look so short.
I only got 2 pictures.
Shut back so you can see your face. Both of you, lay them in. Back, wait, yeah. No, you better leave it on. And I was going to have you do it. But back. Yeah. Sit like that.
I got a comb for it.
I'm just getting this
Just a little.
here.
Just a little more. No, out of your eye.
Oh, I don't belong in there.
What? Your face is shaded too much.
I don't belong in there.
Would you cut down that? Get cozy. Get cozy. Get cozy.
Not
too cozy, girls. You two in the back.
We don't belong in there, do we?
You're all right. Yes, you do.
They said we did, but I really
Yes, you do. Yes, we want you.
Yeah, they want you.
So we really are lined up. Are we okay?
They're taking
We don't want to look like sardines. Remember I told you that?
Okay. I want you in.
Okay, we're doing it.
Good.
And then Bo Handsome and my
I got a camera. I have to hand somebody. Okay.
Now, I'm just picture.
Here's another camera right here. Here you go, Ivan. I can't get this thing in focus. Catherine.
Can't you get it?
You've already
I
taken
can't
it.
take
Take one with mine. Yeah, I will, Bob.
Take a look and see if that's in focus. Just set on insanity now.
Oh, but where do you punch it? Wow. Sister, it puts your bill.
Okay, you ready? Little blonde is looking up here.
One more.
There we go.
One more.
Smile, Bob.
I'm going to knock that over.
Hey, okay.
Yeah, get cozy there.
Just give me an excuse here. I don't mind.
Get next to Jan there.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay, I've always been too short.
You just push it down, Jackie. Then what do you do?
Well, I'll tell you what. Okay.
Jackie, you push it down, then what do you do?
Okay, everybody say spruce.
That's what it says, push.
Yeah, we're supposed to go in there, Ivan. I don't know what for.
You want me to take a picture with this?
Yeah, we want to meet.
All these cousins.
Bo.
I don't know. Who are the two boys?
Layton and Adam. Layton's my son. Adam is the youngest one. Middle boy. Layton and Layton are two boys.
We're the only ones that are doing
There was all of them. This is Gwen.
Jackie needs to
Or Jackie's. Or Jackie's.
All right, everybody smile.
Okay, probably.
Now do something different. Just put the girls together.
Where is your push? Oh, right here.
Janice,
Oh, that's what.
Winnie,
You want to say all four of us with our little short skirts on.
Oh, I didn't get my camera.
He's good at it. Let him do it. Yeah, he's fine.
Got one on Jackie's though.
Where's Ozzy alone, Dolores?
Go give me your camera. Go give me your camera. Who's this, bud?
No.
That's yours.
Jackie.
Where'd Bo go with your camera, girl?
I know, I've got to get this ready for somebody else to take.
Push as hard as you can, I guess, not stop. I'm spoiled. Mine just...
Okay.